And our first speaker is William Handley, who teaches at the University of Southern California. He's the author of Marriage, Violence, and the Nation in the American Literary West, co-editor of True West, Authenticity and the American West, and editor of the Brokeback Book, From Story to Cultural Phenomenon. He's also the executive secretary and past president of the Western Literature Association. He's the general editor of the University of Nebraska Press's Post-Western Horizons book series, and he's currently working on a book about the artistic representation of time and catastrophe in the US West, of which his talk today is a part. So thank you for being here. The floor is yours now.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all who've organized this wonderful conference. I'm delighted to be here. Over time, in the vast and complex cultural geography of the US West, human beings have enacted their ideas about time. In this geography, temporal assumptions have intermixed and collided, often with catastrophic consequences, such as the fact that settler colonial time consigned indigenous peoples to a prehistory that was used to justify their destruction in the march of so-called universal progress. Today, in the Anthropocene, catastrophe seems to loom for all, however unequally. Indeed, one of what I would call this epic's new universalisms is that the future is no longer what it used to be. In an important sense, however, the future has never been what it used to be in the American West. The West is where models of time have gone to die, as often as they have been enacted or even imprinted on the land and in the built environment, a place where expectations have not been met, where improbable things have happened, where untold catastrophes occur. We think of catastrophe as a swerving away from an expected future, literally from the Greek, a downward turn. But of course, catastrophic outcomes have been pre-inscribed in eschatological Euro-American narratives that assume a theological conception of time in which the past and the future are known all at once and in relation to each other. Again, from the Greek, Christian eschatology was especially punishing to the so-called first and vanishing American, the sort of alpha and omega of settler ideology, that ideology would assign as a key role for indigenous peoples in its narrative of redemption and ultimate ends. Catastrophe as the unexpected and improbable is the way in which we usually experience in life the sudden downward turn of personal, public, or planetary catastrophes, and sometimes all three at once, as in the pandemic. An inherent problem, the unexpected catastrophe as such is an inherent problem for narrative and for representation more generally, especially insofar as any narrative, not just an ideology, already enacts a theological conception of time. Though we might not know what is going to happen when we pick up a novel, it is already written. Any act of artistic creation is in a sense retrospective. It looks back at the anticipated future, more or less disguising its knowledge of future outcomes. What would it mean to represent the true unknowability of a future that is yet already determined? Such a question is germane to the Anthropocene, and is taken up by climate and speculative fiction. Representing a truly unknowable future seems utterly foreign, in contrast to Western early popular fiction, whose formulas were so familiar that while readers might not know exactly what would happen, they pretty much knew how things would turn out in the end, not least because authors offered them from the very start not very subtle cues and clues. Just take descriptions of the cowboy hero at the beginning of The Virginian, for example. Just of his appearance, his very appearance is in a sense a prediction of the future. Readers had as little doubt about the heroic outcome as ancient Greeks had about tragic ones. What is true of suspense in Greek tragedy is also true in early popular Westerns. It was created by delaying the outcome, creating a space of contest, and in that space, the Greek audience could imagine there might be an ending different from the ones that they were already familiar with concerning the houses of Thebes or Atreus. One of the aims of the environmental humanities is to foster a new way of thinking culturally about time in order to accept the reality of a future that is determined but unknown, and to understand the past through the lens of a different future than the past had imagined for itself. Fiction plays an important role in shaping and complicating how we think about probable outcomes. Because the Holocene epic's climatic probabilities have been replaced by the improbabilities of climate change, Amitav Ghosh shows why this epic's unforeseen events pose a problem for literary fiction and the conventions of realism, which have relied upon probability for their realist effects. You know the phrase, you'd never believe it if it were in a novel, right? That's what that refers to. Once relegating the improbable event to the realms of romance and epic, in which it plays a decisive and often magical role that magical realist novels later adopted, serious literature now confronts the task of incorporating the disruptive, catastrophic event into realist narratives of everyday life without the magical dimension, and without correspondence to the familiar conditions and orderly expectations of the realist novel's conventional furniture. Yet, there are past Western American writers and artists, I would argue, who, while they lacked knowledge, obviously, about the epic whose emergence they were living through, nonetheless responded to this problem of the unexpected, precisely because catastrophe was in no way foreign to human experience out west. They did so also in response to the fact that some literary and artistic forms were too indebted to theological conceptions of time and to settler ideologies for their practitioners to have acknowledged, let alone incorporated, the catastrophic event, or what Eva Horn in her book The Future as Catastrophe has called catastrophe without event, the kind of slow-moving nature of climate change. The two artists of the unexpected that I want to focus on today, Albert Bierstadt and Willa Cather, are themselves perhaps unexpected, disturbers of temporal settler assumptions. Given the seeming alignment in their work with romanticizations of the West and indigenous erasure. Indeed, it is because they seem to cater to settler assumptions about time that the unexpected takes on significance. My readings of one painting and one novel today are not aimed at redeeming them from settler ideology, but at demonstrating how settler time, in their hands, carries within it an uneasy doubt that the future is ever what it was supposed to be, an unsettling suggestion that ideas about the past in relation to the future are only soothing fictions. To be sure, time is in reality never how it is represented. That's why it's so tough writing about time, because you're never really writing about time, you're writing about the metaphors of time, whether reified in a clock or projected onto nature in a manner that turns nature into landscape. But then we do not know time without representation. I'm interested in examining artists who are self-conscious about the fictionality of time as sequence, as agency with intended consequence, who create narratives that undermine those ideological and theological faiths about time that they seem simultaneously to represent. This painting is probably familiar to many of you. Indeed, when it was created in 1869 by Albert Bierstadt, its conventions pictorially and ideologically were already quite familiar. Emigrants Crossing the Plains, also known as the Oregon Trail, portrays settlers in covered wagons heading west through a landscape that is both beautiful with its trees on the left and sublime with its craggy peaks on the right. The sun's light, somewhere between calmly reassuring and a little terrifying. The sun's light on the horizon suffuses the whole, connecting foreground and background, making visible and knowable the past and future at a glance, as in the theological conception of time that underlies settler ideology. We know the sun is setting rather than rising because covered wagons tell us this is a Western painting. We also know it is a painting of westering because they are moving toward the setting sun in the west, leaving an Eastern past for a Western future, moving forward through time by moving ahead in space, which is, when you really think about it, one of the craziest ideas, other than follow the plow and it'll start raining, that Americans ever came up with. The pink and golden radiance of the sun's light on the clouds or in the heavens offers a seeming assurance that the spatio-temporal narrative implicit in the frame is a sanctified one. While this painting might be thus viewed as a visualization of manifest destiny, with its Indian teepees almost vanishing into the golden light, you can see them very tinily at the very center, lower part of the picture. They're sort of made visible even as they're kind of just vanishing into that light, and hence vanishing into the future's past, soon to be replaced by the settlers in the foreground. The painting and its historical context actually offer a more complicated ideological picture about Western space-time. After all, this is a setting sun, and soon that light will be gone. In a sense, both the past and the future are vanishing before our eyes, not moving toward a shining horizon, but toward something more like death, which is hinted at by the cow skull in the center foreground, very tiny. Moreover, the year in which Bierstadt paints this is the year the Transcontinental Railroad is completed, which will mark the end of this chapter of settlement by wagon train, replacing one icon of the West with another that is more threatening both to the beauty of Western landscapes and to the lives of the Plains Indians. The painting is perhaps less hopeful than it is mournfully nostalgic, not about an actual past, but about a past idea of the future. As early as 1852, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs stressed the extent to which Native Americans were suffering, quote, from the vast number of immigrants who passed through their country, destroying their means of support and scattering disease and death among them, unquote. As a painter who had developed sympathy with Shoshone, Pawnee, and Sioux Indians he had painted, Bierstadt was no doubt aware when he created this image how the railroad was accelerating the dispossession of Indians for the sake of white property. Plains Indians successfully sabotaged the Transcontinental Railroad in the War of 1866-68, just before Bierstadt painted this work. As recently as 1868, Chief Red Cloud's war councils had aimed to expel white settlers from lands north of the Platte River that had been guaranteed to the Sioux in perpetuity as part of the 1851 Laramie Treaty in western Nebraska, northern Wyoming, and Montana. That year, a second Laramie Treaty, that year of 1868, a second Laramie Treaty initiated the process that would eventually force Red Cloud to accept semi-reservation status in northwestern Nebraska, and that finally, after the illegal white incursions into the Black Hills in the mid-1870s, would lead to his expulsion from Nebraska altogether. In 1870, when the white settler town of Red Cloud, Nebraska was being founded, which was the town Willa Cather's family would move to 13 years later in 1883, which was the same year that the railroads created Uniform Standard Time. Sorry, I know I just threw a lot at you in that little parenthetical insertion. In that year of 1870, Chief Red Cloud was completing a treaty in Washington, D.C. that guaranteed the Oglala Sioux possession of the Black Hills and the Powder River country for peace along Nebraska's Platte River Valley, which was a guarantee only to be upended by the Black Hills Gold Rush 4 years later. Now, Mike Fisher, in an article called Willa Cather and the Burden of Imperialism, that's the subtitle, recounts this history in order to argue that Cather's novel My Antonia, set in the fictional town of Black Hawk, but based on Red Cloud where she grew up, quote, is a story of origins for whites only, unquote, and ignores the Native Americans whose removal was deemed essential for white settlement. Fisher turns to Frederick Jameson's notion of the political unconscious to argue that despite that erasure from her novel, traces of indigenous presence remain. I've pushed that argument further. I have a different take on Cather. I don't think it's just sort of her blindness. I think that, in fact, these traces can be read as an allegory of imperialism and colonialism. After all, she names two bulls who ram their heads against each other, Brigham Young and Gladstone. I mean, she's thinking about imperialism. That we can read that as an allegory through the narrator, Jim's romantic distortions of the past and the profound melancholy that seems to motivate them as he writes his narrative, decidedly his narrative, after having become hugely successful as a lawyer for one of the great railways. With regard to time, the novel is much more complex than a settler paradigm. It begins with a paragraph stating that the best days are the first to flee. And it ends with Jim contemplating what a, quote, little circle man's experience is. Not the bold, straight, rail-like line of time's progressive path. Whatever one's argument about Cather's blindnesses and insights, and usually, of course, both obtain at the same time, what is radical about Cather's work for her time is that it unsettles settler faiths about our progressive future. This is evident in her first Nebraska novel, whose title yet seems to celebrate white settlement, "O Pioneers!" Although taken from Whitman, the punctuation as well as the title. Although Cather writes that her white heroine, Alexandra Bergson, is the first human being to have looked at the Great Plains with love, and writes dismissively, quote, of the feeble scratches on stone left by prehistoric races, so indeterminate that they may, after all, be only the markings of glaciers and not a record of human striving, unquote. Despite these double erasures of indigenous presence, her book is radical in relation to the settler colonial project because it rejects the whole model of time upon which both conservative and radical notions of progress rely. That time is irreversibly headed towards specific outcomes, and that through human agency, we can achieve them. Through plot, novels model temporality, even as they are temporal in nature. While it relies on exceptional events, the realist novel embeds within it a resistance to radical breaks in time because it relies on the probability of sequence and causality. And as Ghosh has argued, as such, the bourgeois realist novel was singularly unprepared to narrate the radical disruption by the climate catastrophe of modernity's conventional temporal regimes, particularly the nation state, let alone to make the vast interconnectedness of Earth its subject. And this is a quote from Ghosh. He says, "The longue durée is not the territory of the novel." But then there's Cather. We might say, "Oh, Pioneers" is set in Nebraska in the 1870s and is about a family and a country, and we would not be wrong. But there are frequent insertions of Henri Bergson's longue durée, and as Susan Rosowski and others have observed, Cather names Alexander Bergson after him. Although several nations and cultures are mentioned in the novel, dozens, or at least a dozen, the adjective American appears only twice to modify boys and law. What also makes Cather's first Western novel radical to our eyes now is how it seems to have reimagined plottedness, agency, and outcomes, decoupling them from human centrality and intention, and more tellingly, decoupling fate from morality. And she does all this while offering a trenchant critique of America's national genre, the Western. Her capacity to narrate catastrophe is derived precisely from her critique of the formula Western's faith engendered rescue and its nationalized and nationalizing telos. From its very opening scene, when Alexandra, described like the cowboy hero as knowing exactly where she was going and what she would do next, rescues her little brother Emil's cat. And for most of the novel, O Pioneer seems to install itself firmly in the realist novel's sense of probability, though through its descriptions of everyday life, and to romanticize the settler. But in the figure of its heroine, and in its setting, it is also revising the formula Western's masculine tropes, and most importantly, the fated plots that Wister and Gray signal throughout their heterosexual romances. Gray, for example, hints to the reader many times how his novel is going to end, just as it began with the rescue of Jane Withersteen. Whereas Alexandra comes to her brother's rescue at the novel's beginning, she fails to save him from being murdered. His hopeful future suddenly ended before it began. To the extent that Cather gives the reader suggestively predictive language, it is deceivingly in line with the formula Western, suggesting we should not actually be worried about final outcomes. The following passage contains the kinds of temporal tensions and ironies underneath an overwhelming feeling of reassurance that we see in Bierstadt's painting. Both spatialize time with the westering sun, yet subtly undermine faith in the security of its destination, even if the first-time reader does know that Alexandra's brother will be murdered. And so it's a jarring experience when you know the novel to then read this passage. Alexandra was well satisfied with her brother as they drove through the rolling French country toward the westering sun and the stalwart church. She was thinking of that time long ago when she and Emile drove back from the river valley to the still unconquered divide. Yes, she had told herself it had been worthwhile. Both Emile and the country had become what she hoped. Out of her father's children, there was one who was fit to cope with the world, who had not been tied to the plow, and who had a personality apart from the soil. And that, she reflected, was what she had worked for. She felt well satisfied with her life. And now, for want of a better, why does my slide not move? Thank you. You've pressed the same thing. You have a magic touch. So forgive the color coding, but I just want to emphasize here, notice the yellows. Well satisfied, she told herself. The reference to her past hope suggests that underneath her confidence is a doubt. I tell myself, about the potentially arbitrary connections between her brother and the country, between settlement and the land before conquest, connections that are meant to suggest a prosperity that would make the whole settler enterprise worthwhile. When connected to the sun, westering is that ambiguous sign of the future, both promise and decline. But when paired with stalwart, the term seems to promise stability and hope, representing as it does a faith in the conquering of death itself. Death is never defeated in Cather's work. Instead, it defeats the best laid plans. Notably, Alexandra's feelings are in the context of they're going to a church supper and anticipating a wedding to take place at the church a week later between Signa and Nelsa Jensen. As soon as they arrive at the church, Amédée Chevalier, quote, a proud father of 1 week, listen to all the temporal references here, rushed out and embraced Emile. This is what is extraordinary about Cather's novel. Within a week of that embrace, and within a few pages of Alexandra's rosy ruminations about the significance of her life's work, both Emile and Amédée will be dead. Minutes before Amédée, who suddenly falls ill and says, I got no time to be sick, dies of a burst appendix, his wife speaks about his illness without much anxiety, not because she was indifferent, Cather writes, but because she felt so secure in their good fortune. Only good things happened to a rich, energetic, handsome young man like Amédée with a new baby in the cradle, unquote. 2 days before her husband, Frank Shabata, will shoot and kill her and Emile. For Marie Shabata, we are told, the years seem to stretch before her like the land, spring, summer, autumn, winter, spring, always the same patient fields, the patient trees, the patient lives, always the same yearning and the same pulling at the chain until the instinct to live had torn itself and bled and weakened for the last time until the chain secured a dead woman and who might cautiously be released. With the knowledge of what is to come, the reader would see this as foreshadowing, but in this context, Maria is resigning herself to never seeing Emile again. He is soon to depart, and to her deadening marriage to Frank. Moreover, like Amédée's wife, the one who will suffer most over the coming sudden loss, Alexandra, quote, felt no anxiety about Emile. She always believed in him as she had believed in the land. She had no doubt that he would soon be settled in life, unquote. No doubt, settlement. Note how both Marie and Alexandra model their confidence on the predictability of climate and land. In Marie's case, the seasonal patterns that gave birth to human culture in the Holocene. We know now, of course, what this novel does not know, that those patterns are themselves capable of turning. Cather also understands that human technological inventions, no less than nature, produce unintended catastrophic results. Where the cowboy hero in Formula Westerns uses guns with great intentionality and efficiency, and I love that image that Nick had up at the beginning of his talk, the holster, the hand, like you know where it's going, right? That image is temporal in nature. Cather inverts the lines of agency between technology and the human. It is telling that the sudden catastrophic turn in Cather's plot is actually owed to non-human agency, as shootings in Westerns never are. They're always very human. Frank Shibata's jealous psychology is, of course, the primal agent in the murder of his wife. But even after, quote, an idea flashed into his mind and his sense of injury and outrage grew, unquote, there is no indication that he intends murder, despite his anger. Rather, the .405 Winchester itself is described as, quote, murderous, the murderous Winchester. Guns kill people, Cather would reply simply to today's gun advocates. Indeed, quote, he had not the faintest purpose of doing anything with it. He would have been paralyzed with fright had he known that there was the slightest probability of his ever carrying out any of his dark projects, unquote. When he hears the murmuring of Emile and Marie making love in the grass, quote, the gun sprang to his shoulder, listen to the verb, and he shoots mechanically. When it dawns on him what he has done, he crouched, quote, like a rabbit, and then ran like a hare from dogs. It was, quote, inconceivable that he should have hurt a woman, unquote. The inconceivable happens. The settler future is shattered. A man kills a woman. With an assist from technology that escapes the human agency and intention that created it. Cather's fiction does not, of course, foresee the improbability of what we now see as a logical outcome of human so-called progress, including the technological climate catastrophe. Yet her narrativizing of the sudden downward turn is presciently preparative and reparative of the epistemological crisis we now face. Published 1 year after Riders of the Purple Sage, which inaugurated the gunslinger, and I'm so glad, Nick, that I now learned that that is an anachronistic term to apply to him. O Pioneers itself marks a sudden turn in the literary history of writing about the West. Renouncing the heterosexual marriage plot with brutal violence, Cather refuses a reproductive futurity. Alexandra has no children, neither does the railroad man who narrates My Antonia. By so embedding her characters in the non-human world, by refusing the factitious discontinuities of the fiction of nation, and by representing a radical break between human intention and outcome, and between technology and agency, Cather's fiction is a bracing, heartbreaking, and humbling disruption of cherished temporal models which are among the many casualties of climate change, with its many unintended consequences of human endeavor. Her work disabuses us of our derangements about time so that we may, like the professor in the professor's house, feel the ground under our feet and know where we are, able to, quote, face with fortitude the future, unquote. What we are left with in her work, what Alexandra is left with, is the land, mute, denationalized, non-anthropomorphic, eluding human time and possession. Thank you.
Thank you, William, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. Now we will move on to our next speaker, James Deutsch.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Yeah, switch.
Okay, so in the meantime,